Why you stop looking once the pressure drops. There is a moment when the pressure finally drops. The question feels lighter. The inner strain softens. The need to know no longer feels so sharp. And almost immediately, the search begins to fade. Not because the truth has fully appeared, because the discomfort has decreased enough for the mind to stop pushing. This is the pattern. You do not always stop looking because you truly understood. Very often, you stop looking because you can finally breathe. The urgency falls. The tension loosens. And once that happens, part of the system starts treating the whole thing as finished. But relief is not always the end of the process. Sometimes it is only the end of the pressure. That difference matters, because what becomes quieter can still remain unclear. What hurts less can still remain unresolved. What no longer feels urgent can still be incomplete. And yet, the mind often stops there, not because clarity arrived, because pressure left. That is why certain questions do not stay open until they are truly understood. They stay open only until they become bearable enough to stop searching. What makes this pattern so difficult to notice is that stopping feels reasonable. You tell yourself, I already know enough. I've thought about it enough. I don't need to keep going. I can leave this here. And sometimes that is true. But often something else has happened first. The pressure became more tolerable. That is the shift. Not full understanding. A softer nervous system, a quieter urgency, a lower emotional cost to leaving the question open. And because the cost dropped, the mind begins to feel as if the work is done. This is the confusion. You do not always stop because clarity arrived. Sometimes you stop because the discomfort stopped pushing you. That means the search was never guided only by truth. It was being guided by pressure. And once pressure falls, attention loosens. Not toward completion, toward relief. That is why certain questions lose importance the moment they stop hurting, even if they never became truly clear. This is why relief can quietly become the stopping point, not because it answered the question, because it removed the feeling that the question had to be answered now. That is the hidden move. The mind begins searching under pressure. Then pressure drops, and the search starts feeling less necessary. Not because the truth has been reached, because the system is no longer being driven by the same urgency. This is what makes the pattern so deceptive. You think, I'm done with it. But often, what ended was not the process, only the strain. And once the strain is gone, the mind starts losing interest in what it was pursuing. Not because it became irrelevant, because it stopped hurting enough to hold attention in place. This is why some things are not fully understood. They are only no longer pressing. That is the threshold to notice. The moment you stop looking, not because you found clarity, but because the pressure that made you look is no longer strong enough to keep the search alive. What makes this pattern even more persuasive is that relief starts sounding like wisdom. The mind says, if it mattered that much, I would still feel it. If it were really important, I would still be searching. If the pressure is gone, there must be nothing left to see. But that is not always true. Pressure is not the same thing as depth. A thing can stop hurting before it becomes clear. A question can stop pressing before it becomes honest. A decision can stop feeling urgent before it becomes right. That is the distortion. The mind keeps assuming that what no longer demands attention must no longer need attention. But often, what changed was only the inner temperature. The heat dropped. And because the heat dropped, the search lost its fuel. This is why stopping can feel so final. Not because the process ended, because the discomfort that kept it alive fell below the point where the mind still felt compelled to keep looking. This is why some answers start feeling complete the moment they stop hurting. Not because they revealed everything, because they no longer demand anything. No more pressure, no more urgency, no more inner push to keep turning toward them. And once that happens, the mind relaxes into a dangerous assumption. If I'm no longer driven to look, there must be nothing left to find. That is the deeper pattern. You stop measuring by clarity, you start measuring by relief. If the weight is gone, you assume the truth arrived. If the question softened, you assume it matured. If the discomfort faded, you assume the process finished. But fading strain is not the same as finished understanding. Sometimes it only means the mind found a more livable distance from what was unresolved. This is why stopping can feel honest, even when it is premature. The system is no longer searching for what is true. It is settling for what is tolerable. And tolerable can feel so clean, so quiet, so reasonable, that it becomes very easy to call it clarity before clarity has actually formed. This is why the end of pressure can feel so convincing. It creates silence, and silence is easy to mistake for completion. The mind says, there is nothing more here. I don't feel pulled anymore. It must be settled now. But often what disappeared was not the question, only the force that kept you facing it. That is the difference most people miss. Looking can be driven by truth, but it can also be driven by discomfort. And when discomfort fades, the search can stop, even if truth has not fully arrived. This is the deeper cost. You begin to trust the absence of pressure more than the presence of actual understanding. Now the thing feels done, not because it ripened, but because it quieted. And quieting can happen early, before the real shape has been seen, before the deeper meaning has become honest, before the unfinished part has had time to reveal itself fully. That is why some things keep returning later with a different face. Not because they were impossible, because they were left at the first moment they became bearable. And bearable is not always clear. Once this becomes visible, something begins to change. Not because every question suddenly stays open longer, but because the drop in pressure is no longer confused with the arrival of truth. You begin to notice that stopping the search is not always the same thing as finishing the process. Sometimes it only means the discomfort fell below the level that kept you looking. That distinction matters, because once it is felt, the mind stops trusting silence so blindly. The quiet may still come, the urgency may still soften, the question may still feel less heavy, but now that does not automatically mean there is nothing left to see. This is where the pattern weakens, not when pressure never drops, when the end of pressure no longer gets mistaken for the end of the truth. And once that changes, something more honest becomes possible. Not endless searching, better stopping. The kind that comes because something truly settled, not just because the strain became easier to carry. That is the difference between relief and real clarity. This is why unfinished clarity can look so convincing once the pressure is gone. The mind is no longer being pushed, so it starts believing that what remains must already be enough. Enough understanding, enough meaning, enough resolution to let the whole thing rest. But often, what is resting is not the process, only the demand. The demand to know, the demand to decide, the demand to keep turning toward what was still unclear. And when demand disappears, the mind can mistake reduced effort for completed insight. That is the hidden move. You are no longer being pressed, so you assume there is nothing more to learn. But many things do not become false just
just because they became quiet. They simply stop calling for attention with the same force. This is why stopping early can feel so clean. Nothing is shouting anymore. And once nothing is shouting, the system wants to believe the whole thing is done. But silence is not always resolution. Sometimes it is only what remains when urgency lets go before understanding has fully ripened. That is why the pattern can repeat so easily. You stop looking at the first moment it becomes easier to stop, not at the moment it becomes genuinely clear. This is inner cognition.